Thank you very much for clicking on freemarketnews.com. I'm John St. George. My guest, Edward Griffin. Mr. Griffin is the author of the book Creature from Jekyll Island, plus many others. So you've been saying to yourself, the government's a mess in one way or another. How do these messes start? Where do they come from? Earlier we've been talking about collectivism. Mr. Griffin gave us some definitions of what that is. And then two tentacles form out and form something equally as ugly throughout history, Leninism and Fabianism. And we're going to find out what these two things were, and are they still around today? Ed Griffin, good to have you with us.
Thank you very much, John.
I think just to kind of back up a little bit, give us another definition of collectivism, then I want to get into Leninism and Fabianism.
Right. These are strange words to our ears in modern times. Collectivism is a word that was used quite freely in books of a few decades ago, but it's a word that's been lost to us today. Roughly defined, it is the concept that government is the solution, the proper solution for most of man's problems. So a collectivist, and this is not a technical definition, but it's a pretty good substitute. A collectivist is a person who believes that if you have a problem and you want to improve society in any way, that the solution should be through government action, through coercion, using laws to bring these things about, and if necessary to sacrifice individuals or minorities, if necessary, for the greater good of society. And you find this philosophy embedded in some of the rather dreaded philosophies or tyrannies of our recent history, like communism and Nazism and fascism, are all based on these principles of sacrificing individuals, if necessary, for the greater good of the greater number. And of course, that always translates into the greater good of the state. The state is presumed to be the greater number of society. So that's basically what we're talking about, collectivism. And what many people don't realize is that collectivism exists today in two forms. And here are some more words that are not very well known. Now, Leninism is fairly well known because we remember the name of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who was one of the firebrands of the Bolshevik Revolution and quite a prolific writer and a theoretician. Lenin took the theories of Karl Marx and converted them into a living fighting force. See, Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto. And there are millions of Marxists around the world who have read his works and believe his theories. Basically, his theories were: workers of the world, unite. Throw off the chains of your capitalist exploiters. Recapture control of the means of production. Unite against war and racism. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need, and on and on and on. These are very famous and popular slogans that Marxists in general they buy into this. And because they're basically idealistic people, they think that would be a better society than we have now. But the fact of the matter is that all of the countries, historically, that have been taken over by communism, that we used to say behind the Iron Curtain, none of those countries were ever taken by Marxists. They were all taken by another group called Leninists, or Marxist-Leninists, sometimes they call themselves that. And those are people who also believe in the writings of Karl Marx, but they believe in the writings of Lenin, who organized the Communist Party, who said basically we must have organization, we must have structure, we must have discipline, we must have communications, we must have training, we must have leadership. He created a fighting force. And so that is the fighting force that took over all of these countries. So Leninists are a notch above Marxists.
They sound like they were more doers.
They were doers, exactly. The Marxists tend to be the theoreticians. The Leninists are the doers, the ones that go out and make it happen. See? So there's a very important distinction between the two. And it's interesting, I think, to know that even in the heyday of communism, most of the top communists did not refer to themselves as communists. They referred to themselves as Leninists.
Interesting.
It's very interesting and it's very significant because the word communism is kind of a catch-all phrase. Lenin and Marx both taught that communism was something for the future. They were establishing what they called socialist republics.
It's like a Christian saying, I'm a Calvinist. You know, that's another, I'm going to subscribe to a theology as opposed to the primary foundation.
Yeah, they were working toward the future. Communism would happen, they said, when finally mankind was perfected and the state would wither away. Ha ha. Yeah, we saw a lot of that happening, didn't we? But anyway, that was the theory. In the meantime, what they were building was socialism, they said. And those people called themselves Leninists. So when it came time for the crumbling of the communist empire, so-called, all these people did was take off their hats that said communist, put that down, and put another hat on that said social democrat. But you notice that the heads underneath the hats didn't change. And their ideas didn't really change. They talked about open markets and being friendly to the West and all these sort of things, freedom of speech. They gave a lot of verbiage to that. But, and some of that actually happened, but underneath, the police state didn't change. They still maintain a very strong military, and they're still preparing for international war. The KGB changed its name, but it didn't change. It just got bigger and better funded and so forth. Nothing really changed except the label. And it's interesting to note that this is one of the basic strategies of Lenin. Lenin was quite a strategist. For example, he said, comrades, it makes no difference what you think or what you know, how many books you've read, how good a debater you are, how smart you are. None of that is important. All that matters, he said, is to come to power. You must come to power. Now, once you do that, then you can afford debate, because if you have the power, you can shoot anybody who disagrees with you. He actually said that. He's quite a guy. He said, you know, promises are like pie crusts made to be broken. He was a strategist, and he considered that he and his followers were at war with the rest of the world, and they were going to conquer the rest of the world.
How different do you think he is from Saddam Hussein?
Well, not an awful lot different at all, no.
He's a thug.
He's a thug, but he was probably smarter than Hussein, and he developed a world following. And he had much better strategies, and of course he had better funding and all that sort of thing.
Interesting that he's focusing on power, and as you were talking, I'm seeing, well, here we have a philosophy trying to create a level playing field. You know, it doesn't matter what you know, it doesn't matter what that, you know, all the good for the state, and we're going to break down the different classes. Is that something he was a devotee of as well, or was he just more?
No, what you're talking about there is more of a Marxist theology. See,
the theory guy.
The theory guy, yeah, that's right. Theory guy. Lenin basically said none of that makes any difference. That you use it if necessary to get followers or to make it sound like what you're doing is noble. But the only thing that matters, he said, is to come to power. And I'll give you an example. He said, for example, if you were to go into a country that we're trying to take over, and those people had a strong culture, strong nationalistic feelings, they didn't want to give up their history and their nationalism. So what do you do, comrades? Do you go in there and tell them that that's stupid? Do you go in and preach internationalism that we know is the way of the future? So no, of course not, because they would reject you. You go in and tell them what they want to hear. Be the best nationalist leader there. Let them follow you, thinking you represent them, so that you can come to power. Once you're in power, he said, then you can betray them, because you've got the power. See what I'm saying? And then Lenin said, you go into a country where they don't like us communists very much. What do? Go and say, we are a communist? No, don't be stupid, comrade. You go in and tell them that you're a non-communist, or better yet, tell them you're an anti-communist. Form anti-communist organizations and lead your own opposition so that you will not be defeated. Put up a good show, he said. Make it look good. Actually do some really effective things now and then, but always control your own opposition so that you can come to power.
So Leninism is a form of tweaked communism with a goal that is of a detriment to the fellow man because you want to go for power.
Well, communism doesn't really exist as such. It's something you can't define, but Leninism you can. And the point I'm trying to make is, I'm getting slowly to it here because we're going to talk about Leninism versus Fabianism.
I'm doing the what comes first, the chicken or the egg thing. I
Right.
I don't know.
Well, it's hard to define, but you see, one of the theories that Lenin taught was the strategy of a feigned defeat or feigned retreat in order to lure your enemy into a vulnerable position. And this is not original with him. You can find this in the history books. I discovered that strategy brilliantly taught by Tamerlane, the Mughal warrior. He would when he was confronting a superior military force, he couldn't defeat them one-on-one on the open battle. So what he would do is just before nightfall, and because they never fought at night, they always fought in the morning when the sun came up, he would make it look like his forces were retreating. He would put his forces, first of all, in a very vulnerable location where they couldn't defend themselves very well. It looked like it was a stupid act, and the enemy would say, "Ha, look at that idiot, he put himself into a vulnerable position. We'll get him in the morning." But just as the sun set, he would make it look like he was retreating. He would put his major forces, half of them off to the right in a hidden location, another half to the left in a hidden location in the trees and bushes and the rocks and so forth. He'd have a few soldiers to be seen, and all of the camp followers with their wagons and their horses and their cattle and oxen would leave, and they'd drag branches behind them to kick up the dust to make it look like the whole army was retreating. And and they would do that, I said in the evening. Actually, that's not correct. They do that as the sun was coming up, so that the enemy who was waiting for the sun to come up say, they're retreating, the cowards are retreating, let us attack.
Let's go for it.
Go for it. So they would come galloping down right into the position of indefensible location there, and of course they'd be trapped by both sides. So this is not original with Lenin. It was taught by Tamerlane. Sun Tzu taught it in his famous little treatise, An Art of Warfare. But Lenin applied it to the strategy of diplomacy and politics.
Wow.
And he said, therefore, let us pretend to be defeated and destroyed so our enemies will lower their guard. And the first time that happened was when the Bolsheviks first came to power. The economy was in a terrible state. People were starving, they couldn't produce anything, and they desperately needed money from the West. And so Lenin called his followers together and he said, all right, comrades, we gotta drop our rhetoric for a while. We gotta quit talking about killing the dirty capitalists. He said, we all know we're gonna do that someday, but for now we need them. So let's open a hand of friendship to them and talk about free markets and investments and so forth. This was way back in 1917, all right? This is way, way back. And it worked. And of course, the West came in with money and investments, and then after a while, they built their industry up. They saved themselves from collapse so they could stay in power. And this is what he said, do whatever you must do to achieve and maintain power. So they got to that position, and then they changed their voices again and said, okay, we're going to kill the capitalists. And they expropriated all of the property that had been invested and so forth.
They could not have won without Western assistance. There is no question about that. Then they were starving. The factory, they couldn't operate the factories because the Bolsheviks shot all the managers and the technicians. Either that or they left Russia. The factories were closed down, and Russia was starving. By 1922, Lenin himself said the end has come. They had no food. They had these closed down plants. The plants were not destroyed in the revolution. That's what the textbooks will tell you, including Cannon, the State Department expert. He says the plants, the Russian factories were destroyed in the revolution. They were not destroyed. Why? Because I've seen the photographs after the revolution and right in the Hoover Institution Tower. There are these massive boxes of photographs of Russian industry after the revolution. They could not operate the plants. So what do we do with Averell Harriman and the National Chase Bank and National Bank and our old friends on Wall Street? They go in there. And of course the Hoover mission to feed Russia. We go in there and we have these 250, 300 concessions in which American companies went into Russia and they started up the idle plants. Abel Harriman took the manganese concessions, Arm & Hammer, Occidental Petroleum took the pencil factories and the asbestos plants. And all these top capitalists went in and they got Russia going on behalf of the Bolsheviks, because the Bolsheviks either shot or kicked out all the people who could all the Russians who could run plants. Another point, the Tsarist industry was at a very high level. Your textbooks will tell you that Tsarist industry was backward. It wasn't until the Soviets came along that it began to make progress. This is absolute nonsense. The Soviets, the Russians in 1913 had 2 indigenous Russian vehicles, Russian automobiles. There has never been an indigenous Soviet automobile. They've all come from the West. The Tsarist Russians produced an airplane in 1916 with a wingspan longer than the 747. This is not known today. It's just wiped out history. Technologically, the Tsarist Russians were at least on a par with the rest of the world. They only began to decline when the Soviets took over. And then you've got the long history from that point onwards, how you got the first 5-year plan, 1929, 1933. I look at the first 5-year plan, I look at every plant that was built in Russia at that time. Every single plant was built by a Western company. Not one single plant was built by the Soviets. You name any plant, if there are any Russians here from way back, you name any plant in the first 5-year plan, and you know as well as I do who built it. It wasn't the Soviets, it was a Western company. And you run down the list, Caterpillar tractor, there are more Caterpillar tractors in the Soviet Union than are outside the Soviet Union. Ford Model A, Ford built the Gorky plant. And as soon as the Ford engineers left, they started to turn out military vehicles. You name it, in the first 5-year plan, every single plant was built basically by American companies, but a lot of British, French, and German and Japanese were in there too. Then the second 5-year plan in the 1930s was a duplicate. They tried to copy the first 5-year plan with their own resources. They fell flat on their faces, and they had to come back to the Western companies for assistance to duplicate the plans put in the first 5-year plan. And for example, I was in Douglas Aircraft Company. They let me into their files. And it was amazing, the detailed assistance given by Douglas Aircraft. They bought one DC-3, and then they bought a DC-3 in sub-assembly, and all kinds of duplicate spare parts to get the thing going. And then we've got that story, I don't know how much detail you want, which continues right up to today, July 1, 1987, and you mentioned, I think, this morning, the Toshiba, and the Toshiba Japanese plant, and the Norwegian company, a government-owned plant, which provided the milling machines which enabled now the Soviet submarines to be 10 times quieter than they were before, and that's going to cost us $4 billion so that we can offset what we have given them. And this stupidity has continued stupidity in my sense. From the viewpoint of a Wall Street capitalist, I guess it's smart business. This has continued for 60 years.
And this supposedly by our allies, but this is not the people of Japan and Norway.
No.
This is again the internationalists.
It's the internationalists. Toshiba represented on the Trilateral Commission founded by David Rockefeller in 1973. It's your top corporate elitists, your top corporate establishment attorneys, your top politicians. Senator Mansfield once said, you don't get along unless you go along.
They've done that several times in history, and so when I saw this so-called breakup of communism, I said, well, there they go again, you see? But people don't know this history. They don't know the strategy of Lenin. And so they took it, once again, they took it at face value. Now you listen to the speeches of these old-time Bolsheviks or communists, so-called Leninists, what they really are, and they'll be talking about how bad Stalin is and so forth, and we're sure glad we don't have that anymore. Well, by the way, they're rebuilding a statue of Stalin right now in Moscow, so that cycle is about to go through again. Yeah, well, you know, big surprise. Yeah. But they said, we're so glad not to have this old-style communism anymore, and you go on and on and on about free markets and investments and so forth. And then they'll say once in a while, but don't forget, we will never abandon the principles of our great leader, Lenin. Well, Not one person in 1,000 knows what that means. If you know the principles of the great leader Lenin, what he's really saying to his followers is, hey, comrades, this is the game we're playing. We're going through this cycle one more time so that we can consolidate our power and lull our opponents into an indefensible position, make them vulnerable so that we can smash them with our clenched fist, is how he used to say. So having said all of that, this is Leninism. It still exists in the world.
Yeah.
Not under the name of communism, but under the banner of Leninism.
Very interesting. So we had communism and then Leninism has come to be. And then there was the second branch that we opened with originally, Fabianism.
Well, this is the branch of communism that is perhaps the least known in the Western world.
Yeah.
And yet it is the most important to us in the Western world because we live in it. It is what is directing our lives. The word Fabianism comes from the Fabian Society, which was formed in England in 1884, just before the turn of the century, when a lot of these things were happening.
Fabian Society.
Fabian Socialist Society, they called themselves, and still do. They're still
There's
there.
that socialist word again.
Well, they love the word socialist, but in their literature, they talk about it as they should, as collectivist. They say we are collectivists, and sometimes they use the word socialist interchangeably with it. The Fabian Society was named after a Roman general by the name of Quintus Fabius. And he was famous in history for defeating his enemy not by beating him on the battlefield, but by wearing him down in delaying tactics. In other words, he would wear his enemy down by refusing to make a frontal engagement against the Carthaginians. That was the main ones that he was, Hannibal and people like that.
Wow.
And he just kept, delaying, and finally the attacking forces would give up, and they'd say, we can't stay on the battlefield here for years,
Yeah.
So they'd go home. And so he was famous for delaying tactics and drawing things out. The Fabians selected him as their symbol or the symbolic name on purpose. They objected to the Leninists, not on the basis of their goals of collectivism, because they agreed with that. They were saying to the Leninists, you people are stupid. You're going about it in the wrong way. You are trying to conquer the world and make a new world order based on the model of collectivism through force and violence and bloodshed and quick revolution. That's the wrong way, they said. The proper way is patient gradualism. They said, let's follow the motto or the tactics of Quintus Fabius and delay so there's no confrontation and drag it out over a long period of time. And instead of confronting your enemy head on, we will infiltrate his institutions. We will move our people into his government agencies, into his educational institutions, and into his charitable organizations, into his corporations, and we'll gradually convert the world to international socialism in that fashion.
This dragging it out sounds like Congress.
It is Congress. This is what's been going on in England and in France and Germany and in the United States. The move toward what they called socialism or communism, they said, would be gradual in such a way that there'd be no violent revolution, but at the end of the line, they would have it, and nobody could say it happened on such and such a date. So the Fabians use as their symbol the turtle. That's actually their symbol to signify coming to power slowly but surely. Now, who are the Fabians? Well, when they were formed, of course, there were such well-known people as Arnold Toynbee, the famous historian, H.G. Wells, there was George Bernard Shaw, Beatrice and Sidney Webb, who were founders of the London School of Economics, which is where President John F. Kennedy went and learned all of these Fabian socialist concepts that he instituted when he was president of the United States. The Fabians work quietly and behind the scenes. You don't hear about them. Not all of the people that practice Fabianism are members of the Fabian Society. Tony Blair, right now, who's the the head of the British government, he's a member of the Fabian Society. But most of the Fabians in the world are not actual dues-paying members, but they follow the strategy of Fabianism nevertheless. And that is the philosophy that dominates the United States of America. Now, these two groups both agree with each other on the ultimate goal, but they fight against each other very vehemently at times for domination, as to see who is going to control this new world order.
They have their own battle going on with them. So.
Their own internal power struggles. And when you look at the United Nations today, almost all of those factions fall into either the Leninist group or the Fabian group. And they may appear to be opposed to each other on issues, but if you look at the issues, it is never the issue of collectivism that they're opposed to. They agree that the New World Order at the UN has got to be strengthened, given more military, more money, and so forth. All they're fighting about is who is going to be in the best jobs there. That's all.
So the bigger threat to me sounds like Fabianism because of its stealth qualities.
I would say in the Western world it is a bigger threat because the Fabians specialize in countries which have a developed parliamentary system where people are used to voting in their own dictators. I say that advisedly. They got used to that.
You must all know half a dozen people at least who are no use in this world, who are more trouble than they are worth. Just put them there and say, sir or madam, now will you be kind enough to justify your existence? If you can't justify your existence, if you're not pulling your weight in the social vote, if you're not producing as much as you consume, or perhaps a little more, then clearly we cannot use the big organization of our society for the purpose of keeping you alive, because your life does not benefit us and it can't be of very much use to yourself.
But the Leninists seem to specialize in countries where self-rule is not generally expected. In other words, third world countries and backward countries where people are quite used to dictatorships, open and above board dictatorships. They wouldn't know what to do with a vote anyway because it's not part of their culture. It'll take a long time before they get there. So where there are parliamentary structures in place and people are used to going and voting for things, that's where you find Fabianism coming to the front because that's ready-made for their strategy. But where violent revolution and blood in the streets and overthrowing a hated regime is the method of bringing about political change, as in Africa, Asia, many countries in South America, that's where Leninism comes to its front. And these are the two factions that dominate the world today. You must understand that reality.
People keep forgetting that Nazi regime in Germany was also socialist. It was, they officially were called National Socialist Workers' Party. So it's a branch of socialism. The Soviets were international socialists, and those were, in Germany, national socialists. So it's the same thing in reality, only slightly different interpretation.
Part of the left went to Hitler, at least in France. Part of the socialists went to become advocates of Hitler.
Their idea was to destroy old order in Europe. And that was Stalin's big idea. Let Hitler be a bad guy. He will go and destroy all the order in Europe. There will be no parliaments, no trade unions, no armies, no governments, and then Stalin will come as a liberator. Liberator. Millions of people will be sitting in concentration camps, hoping for someone to liberate them. And Stalin and the Red Army will come as a liberator. That was his plan.